very nice background you have already managed to
Thank
establish.
you. 5 minutes ago, not so nice, but yes. Thank you.
In the world of Zoom calls, that has to be the number one priority now when you move into a new space,
Yeah.
I guess. It used to be the kitchen, but now it's
Right,
your
right,
Zoom
right,
background.
right.
So Randall, you've been in contact with Tier. My name is Jason, and so yeah, thanks. Tier apparently said we invited you on years ago, and we dropped the ball. So,
Oh, is that right?
Our bad.
I've forgotten that. So
I believe it was towards the tail end of the pandemic when we were kind of coming out of things, and
right.
so I think that was at least that's the excuse we will use, is that
Okay.
we were just getting back to real life.
well, I mean, my excuse is that I will blame Tier, but that's okay.
There you go. And where are you guys located?
We're both just outside of DC
Yeah.
in Northern Virginia.
Northern Virginia. Okay. All right. Okay.
And where are you now?
Well, right now I'm in Wallala, California, which is up on the North Coast. So this is where we spend half the year, and I have to head back to teach at Dartmouth in another week or so.
So sounds rough. Sounds rough.
Yeah, I know. Pretty good life.
So I know Tier is a big fan of your book, and he wants to talk about that. But I couldn't help. When I Googled you, one of the things that came up first a couple weeks ago was this op-ed you wrote for the LA Times. Are women in the pulpit the reason mainline Christians are leaving the pews? And so I just what prompted you to write that, and what is your argument?
The prompt for writing it was the 50-year anniversary of the ordination of the Philadelphia 11 in the Episcopal Church. That was the catalyst for it. But yeah, I have to say, as an Episcopal priest, I've long benefited from the ministry of women, and I think they're being made the scapegoats for what's happening in mainline Protestantism. So I was trying to argue against that.
Okay, so yeah, it's a good article. People should, because I think the question, I don't know if you chose the question for the title or not.
But, I didn't. No, I didn't.
Yeah, I do think it's a question that, yeah, it's a vibe, I think, that exists in the church.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Especially when we're looking for, we want to find a reason.
Yeah, that's right.
It's easier to blame another group of people than to look at the broader institution, the broader world around us, and the broader church's culpability, and then where we're
at. I think you're right, and the problem is not unique to mainline Protestantism either. And I actually just had a phone call with a CNN reporter about the exodus, or the hemorrhaging really, of evangelicals from the evangelical world, and it's quite dramatic, I think. And it has nothing to do with women's ordination in this case at all. I think that would be far, far down the list of priorities.
And that's a good segue, because the book, your most recent book in question here, and a lot of your work has called attention to how evangelical Christianity, in a lot of ways, for a long time, has been about other things than the gospel or Christianity. And so just talk about the undercurrent of race in your observations of evangelicalism.
Sure. I should probably begin by saying that I've long defended evangelicals against the charge of racism, and I did for decades. And I did that in part because a lot of megachurches are racially mixed congregations, and that I think is pretty remarkable. Going back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s observation that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning was the most segregated hour in America. In many ways, evangelical churches, at least some evangelical churches, defied that stereotype, and we're able to bring in people of color. Now, in terms of numbers, maybe not so great, but at least there was that presence, at least in some congregations. So I long resisted that and defended evangelicals against the charge of racism. But as I was writing, actually, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, and trying to account for the overwhelming popularity of Donald Trump within the evangelical world, I began to rethink that and try to connect some of the dots. And that is to say that, as I'm sure you know, the religious right as a political movement did not have its origins in opposition to abortion. Evangelicals considered abortion a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s, and I can probably spend the next 20 minutes giving you chapter and verse on why abortion was not the catalyst. And the actual catalyst was defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University, and also segregation academies that many of which were church-sponsored organizations. And so when you juxtapose that with the overwhelming white evangelical support for Donald Trump in 2016 and even more in 2020, that allowed me to connect the dots a little bit and say, wait a minute, something's going on here, and we need to account for race when we think about evangelical political activity over the last half century.
Yeah, talk about the meeting in DC in the early 90s that you mentioned in your preface.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I was at the time a young assistant professor at Columbia University, kind of desperately trying to get tenure, even though I was told I had no chance whatsoever of being tenured at Columbia. And I was invited to this gathering in Washington, D.C. And I remember at the last moment saying, do I really want to go to this thing? Because, I've got a family here, I've got obligations, teaching and so forth. And I decided in the end to go to this meeting. And here I was in a hotel conference room with about 50 people, all of them male, by the way. And here it turns out to be a kind of who's who of the religious right. Ralph Reed was there. Donald Wildman, who started the American Family Association, was there. Paul Weyrich, the architect of the religious right. Ed Dobson, who was one of Jerry Falwell's acolytes at Moral Majority. Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention was there. So I found myself in this odd pain because I didn't feel like I belonged with these people. And turned out the whole thing was supposed to be a 10-year celebration of the election of Ronald Reagan 10 years earlier in 1980. And I hadn't celebrated 10 years earlier, and there was no mood to celebrate then. So here I was, well, I'll make the best of it. And in the first session, Paul Weyrich, who again is the architect of the religious right, made this impassioned statement. He said, let's remember that our movement, meaning the religious right, had nothing to do with abortion. And he was just emphatic about this. And so during the break, right after that session, I went up to him and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do with the genesis of evangelical political activity in the 1970s. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get these people, meaning evangelicals, interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. He said, I tried abortion. I tried the women's rights issue. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried pornography. Nothing got their attention until the Internal Revenue Service started coming after their tax exemption in the 1970s. Well, that got me started on this decades-long quest. I've spent far too much of my life researching this, trying to find out if he was right. And turns out, even though I don't care for his politics, Weyrich was absolutely correct about this. Abortion was a Catholic issue in the 1970s. And actually, I had remembered that myself because in the 1970s, I was cocooned within what I call the evangelical subculture. That is to say, my father had been and was during this time as well, a pastor in the Evangelical Free Church. I went to the denomination's college, Trinity College in Deerfield, and then also to its divinity school for NMA while I was working in the development office at the school, at the seminary. And so again, I remember abortion simply was not a matter of conversation among evangelicals at that time. And so Weirich's observation rang true to me. And then I began to dig further into archives and other sources and found that, again, abortion was not in any way the catalyst for the emergence of the religious right in the 1970s.
To what extent, to what extent can it also be accounted for by, so when I was in college and seminary, I was an avid reader of First Things, and so there was this, it seems like Catholic persuasion of evangelicals that was happening at the same time.
Yeah, there was that, and that raises a fascinating issue: the connection between the religious right and Catholic intellectual tradition. And I think part of the reason for that is that evangelicals didn't have their own intellectual tradition at that time. And that, I'm not saying that facetiously or critically. It was simply a statement of fact. And I think where you really see this played out, by the way, is in Supreme Court appointments over the last half century. That is to say, there are no three presidents who owed their office to the religious right more completely than Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. And so the political payback, the big political payback for any president is a Supreme Court appointment, obviously. And you would think that they would be appointing evangelicals to the Supreme Court. Name one. I mean, where there's no bench. That is to say, they're developing it now. That is to say, there are evangelicals who are moving up through the judicial system and presumably would be available for appointment if Trump is reelected or someone else. But at that time, there was no bench, and so who do they go to? They go to conservative Catholics, just as you were talking about with First Things. So in many ways, the evangelicalism, I think at that time, kind of outsourced its intellectual life to places like First Things, where, of course, abortion was an issue. And that's, I think, in part why it eventually did become an issue for evangelicals. But again, it didn't happen until really the eve of the 1980 presidential election.
As that shift happens, as the bench gets deeper for evangelical judges and folks coming up through the courts, will their appointment, once they're appointed, or once we get to the point where the bench is deep enough, will evangelical be more of a political marker or religious marker at
I think that's a good question. I think it already is, don't you? I mean, it's
I mean, that's trajectory. I don't know if it's a religious decision. I wonder if it's still there down the line.
I agree. And I think there's some evidence, according to polling data, that already the term evangelical is really a political designation more than it is a religious designation. And that, as somebody who grew up as an evangelical and still wants to maintain ties with that movement, I find that deeply distressing. That a movement that has, I think, a rich and distinguished history has been co-opted by political interests, so much so that, as we said, I think there's very little distinction between politics and evangelicalism in terms of label.
So you begin your book with this memory from 1991, I think it was 1990,
in November 1990.
And it's 2024 now, and so I'm wondering if we're entering the end of a period that you charted. That you have Donald Trump now running away from the overturning of Roe. You have just, like he enjoys solid evangelical support, but the Republican Party itself has lost any pretense of family values or being the party of the church or whatever.
That's actually the question my wife asked me last night. How, because I told her we were going to talk about this morning. Her question was, how does like the religious right embrace a morally corrupt standard bearer? Like,
it just feels like there's no effort to even pretend anymore.
Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. I think people like Franklin Graham and Tony Perkins are trying, but it's it's a Herculean effort to do that sort of thing. And then you have these kind of almost painful justifications that Trump is the analog to Cyrus in the Hebrew Bible and all this stuff. And it's just I wince whenever I hear this. It's just so far fetched. I think, but I think we talked earlier about the defection of many evangelicals. I think particularly young evangelicals from the movement over the last several years and even a decade or more. And I think much of that has to be attributed to the fact that they see the hypocrisy. They understand this. Here, they grew up in households where they were told that abortion was this moral evil, and I'm not contesting that it is. I'm just stating this, and that the Bible is our sole source of authority. Family values are preeminent, and then their parents go out and put Donald Trump into the White House. So a younger generation has to see the hypocrisy in that. And I think part of the other thing that's happening too, and again, as I explained to this reporter this morning, I'm not a student. I don't deal in numbers in the sense of surveys and all this stuff. I'm going on impressions more than anything else. But I think the other thing that's happening is that younger evangelicals, are better educated, in part because their parents want them to go to prestigious schools. And I see that a lot of them in my classes at Dartmouth, by the way. And I think as these younger evangelicals are becoming more educated, they are beginning to see these hypocrisies play out within the movement and even on the part of their parents. And so I think that contributes to their disillusionment. And getting back to your wife's question, Tyr, this is the question that's been animating me for years now. I mean, if you were to choose a political messiah based on the values you purport to uphold, I think Donald Trump would be pretty far down the list of candidates for that messiahship. And and again, circling back to the whole issue of racism, I think, and that's what I was trying to demonstrate in Bad Faith. I think unacknowledged and unrepented racism has a tendency to fester. And if it's not addressed, it keeps cropping up again and again and again. I think it did with support of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and I'm happy to go into that as well. But I think most dramatically in the overwhelming white evangelical support for Donald Trump.
Yeah, let me. So I want you to do that, but I'm going to read from your final chapter here because I think that this is important. So, what does it matter that their political movement, the religious right, grew out of racism, a defense of racial segregation in evangelical institutions? On the face of it, it matters not at all. I have no reason to doubt the sincerity of evangelicals who oppose abortion. Some have devoted their entire lives to the cause, even as I suspect the motives of those who brought the issue to their attention. I believe the abortion myth matters because unacknowledged and unaddressed racism has a tendency to fester. black codes and Jim Crow laws emerged out of the Magnolia myth, the enduring fiction that blacks were inferior. John Meacham has pointed out that the 1866 publication of The Lost Cause created a mythology of the virtuous slaveholding South and enshrined the notion of white supremacy as the true cause of the war and the true hope of the South. Ghettos sprang up in northern cities because of lack of opportunities in the workplace, misguided, racially skewed government policies, the intentional construction of lily white communities, and the practice of redlining, the refusal to sell real estate to African Americans or to write mortgages in selected neighborhoods. Police brutality against people of color persists because of stereotyping and lack of attention to racial profiling. I think that's just, you do a good job of pointing out that how we narrate our stories bears directly upon our present.
Yeah, I'm afraid it does. Frankly, I had forgotten I'd written that. It sounded pretty good, actually. I'm persuaded. No, I think that's right. And if we continue to present a sanitized version of our own history with and allow no dissenting voices, I think, it's human nature. You begin to believe it after a time. I mean, I mean, just to expand that a little bit, I think Trump has mastered the art of the big lie, not merely regarding the 2020 election, but anything that is repeated loudly enough and frequently enough and emphatically enough, people begin to believe it. And I think, circling back to your original question with the religious right, the abortion myth, that is the fiction that evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s in opposition to abortion, has been repeated so frequently and so emphatically and so directly that a lot of people believe it. And in believing that abortion myth, that keeps them from addressing the real issues behind their movement, and I think stymies any attempt to move beyond that. I mean,
and I think the point you make here about if you don't correctly tell your story, it allows this racism and antagonism to fester unexamined, and I think you could argue, right, that accounts for the performative cruelty of some of these state by state anti-abortion laws.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about that connection, but I think that's a very good point. Absolutely, yeah.
So, yeah, go back to. In a lot of ways, your book reminds me of Stuart Stevens' "It Was All a Lie" book.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know.
A former Republican campaign guy who wrote a book after 2016, I think.
Is that right? Okay.
Saying that feeling as though the movement he had been a part of was all about racism in hindsight.
I need to look at this book. Yeah. It sounds
like an opportunity to collaborate.
Yeah, it sure does.
So go take us back to the 1980 campaign.
Well, 1980. Again, I always have been a big fan of Jimmy Carter, although I'm not blind to his shortcomings and what happened during his presidency. And as you probably know, I wrote a biography of Carter. But in the 1980 presidential campaign, you had a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher running for re-election in 1980 and facing some pretty stiff political headwinds. I won't pretend otherwise. But the religious right gets together, and this is, these are documented meetings. The first was actually convened by Billy Graham to find a way to elect someone other than Jimmy Carter in 1980. And so they choose Ronald Reagan. And in writing Bad Faith, I was able to look more completely into Ronald Reagan. And I guess I knew some of this, but I hadn't quite put it all together. Ronald Reagan got his start in politics in California in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act that would have removed racial barriers to owning property or renting property. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his presidential campaigns, he kept using these political dog whistles, law and order. He talked about the abuses, the so-called welfare queens. These are women of color who live opulent lives off the public dole. He was never able to produce any of them, but he was sure that they existed, or he sounded sure that they existed. As president, he decimated the Civil Rights Commission, and he maintained support for the apartheid regime in South Africa, even as the regime was beginning to crumble beneath its own weight. And for me, the key moment occurred in the 1980 presidential campaign on August 3rd, when Ronald Reagan chose to open his general election campaign for the presidency in, of all places, the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collaboration with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers during the summer of 1964, the Freedom Summer. And Reagan, of course, was the master of symbolism. And lest anyone in his all-white audience miss his meaning, he invoked that age-old segregationist battle cry that had been made famous by George Wallace, the governor of Alabama: "I believe in states' rights." So for me, drawing the line between, or the connection between, the origins of the religious right in opposition to desegregation and the overwhelming white support of evangelicals for Donald Trump in 2016, that line loops through Ronald Reagan and their support for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And again, let's remember that Reagan was running against a man who clearly was and is an evangelical. That is Jimmy Carter. And everybody knew about him and what he stood for. And I think the deeper historical lesson is that Carter sought to embody, and I think he did, the characteristics of progressive evangelicalism. In fact, in my last interview with him, I asked him if he was comfortable with that term, progressive evangelicalism. He said, yes, he was, even though, as you probably know, Southern Baptists don't like the term evangelical. They consider it a Yankee word, but he was very comfortable with that. He said that, that sums up who I am. And so for evangelicals and for leaders of the religious right, explicitly to reject Jimmy Carter in favor of Ronald Reagan in 1980, I think is probably the first real manifestation of a movement that was born and steeped in racism in the 1970s.
Can you go from 1980 to talk a little bit about the ways that this unexamined racism continues to rear its head in the Southern Baptist Convention?
Well, the Southern Baptist Convention did ostensibly apologize for its origins. And as I'm sure you know, the Southern Baptist Convention came into being in 1845 over the issue of slavery, that is, a defense of slavery, as opposed to the voices of voices of Baptists in the North. That's the genesis of the Southern Baptist Convention. So you talk about a movement that was born in racism. Southern Baptist Convention is a pretty good example of that. But I think more recently, as I follow the Southern Baptist Convention, and frankly, I don't follow every move, but this recent criticism of critical race theory and these condemnations of that sort of rhetoric, I think would be an example of Southern Baptist Convention continuing along that vein.
Is race currently now, going back, knowing its origins now within the religious right and evangelical movement, how does race play out then in their current political strategy and engagement?
Well, I think the most obvious example is the continuing support for Donald Trump, despite all we know about Donald Trump these days. The Access Hollywood video just being one example. But also you see it, I think, in attitudes about immigration and attitudes toward immigrants. And again, this is a movement that claims to take its cues from the Bible. A lot of evangelicals claim to be biblical literalists. Well, what does the Bible say about welcoming the stranger or treating the foreigner as one of your own? Now, we have to acknowledge that the issue of borders is a complicated issue. I don't pretend otherwise, but it seems to me that those sorts of principles that are articulated in the Bible, both in the Hebrew Bible and reiterated by Jesus in the New Testament, have to come into play when you think about immigration policy. I think that would be one example of the persistence of racialized thinking within the religious right, aside from the support for Donald Trump.
So Jonathan Last, who writes for The Bulwark, last week was reflecting on the Democratic National Convention and was he included a screenshot of that image that the Trump campaign put out, where one was a nice, orderly suburban home, and it said, your neighborhood under Trump or whatever, and then there was alongside it was, a picture of just a horde of dark-skinned people in front of a house that just looked chaotic, and there's some language about the third world. And the point of Jonathan Last's piece was that he admits that he has blinders when it comes to race, having grown up in the North, and he honestly doesn't know to what extent racial gesturing like that works for however many voters. And I think, your book also points out that, that, like, who knows how many people are out there that this might work on.
That's true. And as you say, consciously or unconsciously, it's very few people confess to being racist. It's just not, even in Trump's America, it's not considered acceptable to do that unless you're in the white supremacist crowd. But I think we all have, certainly I have to examine myself sometimes and say, whoa, how am I responding to this person, or seeing a person of color in a place where I'm not accustomed to seeing a person of color? How do I react to that? And I always try to monitor myself and say, well, I need to be better. I need to do better on this. It's just, it's human nature. Well, it's not human nature. I think it's learned behavior. And, my father, as I mentioned earlier, was a pastor in the Evangelical Free Church for 40 years. And I honor both his ministry and his memory. And yet I heard him make comments. He would, I remember a conversation about Martin Luther King, and he said, well, I think he's a communist. Well, and that was a fairly typical evangelical sentiment back in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
But, he was participating in that, even though he was, a very, very good person. He was, we are shaped by our environment to a degree we're not willing to acknowledge, I think, in many ways.
I mentioned First Things earlier. So it's one of the things I unsubscribed to First Things a number of years ago now. After they gave Stanley Hauerwas and Robert Jensen and David Bentley Hart the boot. But but it's been fascinating to watch how that kind of Catholic evangelical intellectual journal has been captured by a kind of blood and soil nativism.
Is that right? Okay. I haven't, I don't
Um,
follow it.
and just really, really tenuous justifications for Trumpism. And so you talked about how you deal with impressions, and so I'm just wondering, like when you step back, it's not just about race, right? Like there's something going on in the Catholic world too that doesn't seem to be about race, but it is different than what it once was. And so I'm just wondering what culturally what's happening.
Well, I mean, what do you think, Jim?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's, well, maybe is it anxiety about a coming minority majority country?
Yeah. I think
Is it anxiety about industrial changes to the economic changes?
Sure.
Yeah.
And right. And scapegoating, right? It's a big part of it, right? And you always want to scapegoat someone who at least looks different from you, right? Because otherwise you'd have to examine yourself and find out, or ask to the extent to which you might be complicit in those sorts of changes. So sure, I think that's part of it.
Well, reading your book, I was reminded of how years ago I read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, right? When everybody else was reading it, and I have family in that part of Ohio, and I knew his book was BS immediately because there's no mention of race in it at all. And it's I'm certainly not going to paint every person in Ohio as racist, but like anyone who has family in Ohio, and especially like Appalachia, like the idea that it doesn't come up at all was not believable.
Right.
Well, having grown up, my family in the hills of West Virginia, I mean, even
Really?
today, race and scapegoating is at the heart of making sense of the hardships of their life versus the reality of choices made, and just the circumstance of the chance of geography, right? Like it's someone else's fault,
right,
that this is happening. Now there's no racial diversity in that area, so it common sense would tell you that it can't be that. But that's still the narrative. I remember the narrative as a kid, hearing that narrative as a kid, and it's still a narrative that rings true today. But to your point, right? Like, no one admits that they're racist. No one wants to admit that they're racist.
Right. It's something else, right? It's something else, and which is why critical race theory, I think, plays in. It's such an important thing as a way of trying to understand what's going on here. That there are deep systemic issues that need to be addressed in law, in sociology, everything that conspire against people of color, and I think. I don't think there's any question about that, and why that should be controversial to say that. I mean, it's unsettling. I understand that, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be said. It shouldn't be talked about.
Christians should be the last people to push back against that kind. I mean, it's like this is sin. Like we have a whole language for talking about this.
It's a very good point.
Like we don't need another academic jargon for it. Like
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Ironically, you talk about no one wants to admit how they're bound or captured by racism. I just spoke with a rabbi this morning. He was talking about the coming Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and about repentance. And the last sentence in your book is repentance is good for the soul.
I think it is. I try to make it a daily practice because I need to, I'm sure.
Yeah. just generally though, I'm wondering overall, what is it like to be an academic working at a place like Dartmouth, who is also kind of public in their Christianity?
I get that question a good bit. I have to say that it has not been an issue for me. And as you may know, I came to Dartmouth only a dozen years ago. Before that, I was at Columbia for 27 years. And I have not, at least to my knowledge, encountered opposition, at least nothing that I can really remember as being part of that. And I think the reason for that, frankly, is that early on, and I think throughout my career, I established myself as a scholar. And my scholarship is. I need to repent of this later. This immodesty, but the scholarship is impeccable, and so if I think that has made anyone who might be disposed to be anti-religious or anti-faith toward me probably stop short and say, well, wait a minute, on what basis are we going to impeach this guy's character? He's an academic, his scholarship is sound, and I think it's a little bit harder to make that case. I'm not saying that I'm unassailable. I'm sure I am. There's some weak spots somewhere, especially for somebody who's written quite a bit, but I really haven't encountered that. Now, as you probably know, the place where you're going to find unbelief more than anywhere else in a university or college is a religion department. And so I'm well aware that I'm kind of a soul or a lonely voice within the department. But, again, that's not a venue for proselytization, either in department meetings or, God forbid, or the classroom. That's not my role. But certainly in my writing and I'm an Episcopal priest as well. I do supply work virtually every Sunday, and that's very much part of my life. And I don't apologize for it, and nobody's given me any grief for it, I have to say.
That's cool. That's cool.
I think part of that is, if you allow me to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Part of that is that one of the watchwords for colleges and universities these days is inclusiveness, and I think that the people who are saying that, and by the way, I'm very much in that camp. I mean, they have to live it out at some point, and that inclusiveness includes people who are people of faith. So, they have to kind of live into their own rhetoric, and this is getting a bit off the subject perhaps, but if you look at the history of university and college religion departments for the academic study of religion, most of them, including ours at Dartmouth, began after World War II, when GIs were coming back from particularly the Pacific, and on the basis of the GI Bill of 1944, going to colleges and universities to get educations. And one of the questions was, what is this Shinto stuff that I kept encountering, or what is Hinduism, and so forth. And so a lot of these places, including Dartmouth, had to kind of quickly offer courses in these religions. And so who do they turn to? Very often they turn to former or retired missionaries, people who had some sense of what these religions might be all about. Well, the second generation comes along, and they're educated not in seminaries, but in universities, with a doctorate in religious studies or religion, whatever it might be. And so they become very averse to anyone who has any sort of claim on the faith. And I think now the third generation, which includes people like me, are kind of backing away from that, saying, well, if we mean to be inclusive, we need to be truly inclusive, and so that includes allowing scoundrels like me to be on the faculty. So I think that's what's happened with that.
Yeah, I graduated from UVA's religion department.
Oh yeah, big
and
huge
yeah, and yeah. I mean, there were a few faculty members who were in that second generation that you referred to, but mostly it was it was pretty open to professors who were open confessionally.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and they have several prominent names even to this day who are on the faculty there. So yeah.
So Randall, the way we like to end the podcast is with the 10 questions from inside the actor studio. So what is your favorite word?
Oh my goodness. Integrity.
What's your least favorite word?
Oh, gifted as a verb. I'm a hopeless grammarian, I'm afraid. Insufferable.
What turns you on?
A sense that this is an America-centric comment, but a sense that we as Americans always rise to our better selves, that despite setbacks, and we've certainly had setbacks in the last few years, we eventually come around to trying to live into the ideals that are encoded into our charter documents. That is respect for minorities, being probably the most important one. And my sense is that over the long course of American history, far too slowly in the case of people of color and women and other minorities, but eventually we come around and embrace our better selves. That I guess the question was, that turns me on. That's a rather academic response.
Well, it's a response that doesn't make Tyr uncomfortable. So
I
that's
hate
good.
asking that question, especially the female guests. It's we had one. I won't say who it was because I think Tommy probably fixed it in editing, but she pushed back and was like, "Excuse me."
Yeah.
So, Randall, what turns you off?
I guess that would be the flip side of that coin, would be hatred and intolerance.
Yeah. I was thinking when you gave that, I was thinking of how exhausted I feel by the cynicism and just the rhetoric of everything in America being terrible. It's just exhausting.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I think maybe I'm impinging on one of your questions here, but I think I was asked a couple of years ago to write an essay about hope. And it occurred to me in the course of writing that essay that of the three theological virtues that St. Paul talks about in Corinthians, faith, hope, and love, hope is the only virtue that is volitional. Mm-hmm. That is to say, we can choose to be hopeful. We can't choose faith, especially if you're a Calvinist. You really can't choose love. Love kind of happens in mysterious ways. But an individual can choose to be hopeful. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a theological virtue. Being hopeful is a theological virtue. And I also think that anyone who is a parent, anyone who has children, doesn't have the luxury of despair. So we have to be hopeful.
That's good. That's good. What sound do you love?
I have to say the sound of the ocean, the sound of the sea.
What sound do you hate?
Sirens. I used to live in New York. Remember.
what profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I once thought I wanted to be a politician. In fact, I ran for political office when I was living in Connecticut twice. I came within 4 votes of being elected to the school board. And then the following year, they asked me to run for the state legislature. And unfortunately, I was in a town that was still very deeply infected with the John Birch Society, and I didn't do very well. So at one point, I thought I wanted to be a politician. But I also realized that I'm temperamentally unsuited to be a politician.
Wow.
It doesn't work for somebody like me who's a raging introvert.
I guess we'll have to find out if Fleming Rutledge voted for you or not. Well,
She wasn't a member of she wasn't a resident of the town at the time. I don't think.
what profession would you never want to do?
Oh, but goodness. Never want to do. Well, there's virtue in manual labor, and I honor that. Actually, I started a business a janitorial business when I was in high school, so it wouldn't be something like that. I can't think of a better answer right now. I'll say a tax collector.
And Tier, last question.
Since heaven exists, what do you want to hear when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Well, the biblical response would be, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." I can't imagine a better accolade.
Well, Randall, thanks so much for giving us your time.
My pleasure. I enjoyed the very good, very thoughtful questions. I appreciate it. Always good to have a nice conversation like this.
Here, I will press stop.